John Ruskin. John Ruskin was both the leading Victorian critic of art and an important critic of society. These two roles can be traced back to two important influences of his childhood. His father, a wealthy wine merchant, enjoyed travel, and on tours of the continent he introduced his son to landscapes, architecture, and art. From this exposure, Ruskin acquired a zest for beauty that animates even the most theoretical of his discussions of aesthetics. In his tranquil autobiography titled Praeterita 1885 to 1889, or, as he said, Past Things, composed in the penultimate decade of a turbulent life, Ruskin reflected on the profound experience of his first view of the Swiss Alps at sunset. For his 14-year-old self, he writes, "The scene walls of lost Eden could not have been more beautiful." It is not possible to imagine, in any time of the world, a more blessed entrance into life for a child of such a temperament as mine. True, the temperament belonged to the age, a very few years, within the 100. Before that, no child could have been born to care for mountains, or for men that lived among them, in that way. Till Rousseau's time, there had been no sentimental love of nature. Until Scott's, no such apprehensive love of all sorts and conditions of men, not in the soul merely, but in the flesh. I went down that evening from the garden terrace of Schaffhausen with my destiny fixed in all of it that was to be sacred and useful. Such a rapturous response to the beauties of nature was later to be duplicated by his response to the beauties of architecture and art. During a tour of "this holy land of Italy," as he called it, he visited Venice and recorded in his diary on May 6, 1841, his response to St. Mark's Cathedral Square in that city. "Thank God I am here. It is the paradise of cities, and there is moon enough to make herself the sanities of earth lunatic, striking its pure flashes of light against the grey water before the window, and I am happier than I have been these 5 years. I feel fresh and young when my foot is on these pavements." Ruskin's choice of phrase in these accounts of how beauty affected him reflects the second influence in his life, often at odds with the first, his daily Bible readings under the direction of his mother, a devout evangelical Christian. From this biblical indoctrination, Ruskin derived some elements of his lush and highly rhythmical prose style, but more especially his sense of prophecy and mission as a critic of modern society. Ruskin's life was spent in traveling, lecturing, and writing. His prodigious literary output can be roughly divided into 3 phases. At first, he was preoccupied with problems of art. Modern Painters, 1843 to 60, which he began writing at the age of 23 after his graduation from Oxford, was a defense of the English landscape painter J.M.W. Turner, 1775 to 1851. This defense, which was to extend to 5 volumes, involved Ruskin in problems of truth in art, as in his chapter Pathetic Fallacy, and in the ultimate importance of imagination, as in his discussion of Turner's painting The Slave Ship. During the 1850s, Ruskin's principal interest shifted from art to architecture, especially to the problem of determining what kind of society is capable of producing great buildings. His enthusiasm for Gothic architecture was infectious, and he has sometimes been blamed for the prevalence of Gothic buildings on college campuses in America. A study of the Stones of Venice, 1851 to 53, however, will show that merely to revive the Gothic style was not his concern. What he wanted to revive was the kind of society that had produced such architecture, a society in which the individual workers could express themselves and enjoy what Ruskin's disciple William Morris called work pleasure. A mechanized production line society, such as Ruskin's or our own, could produce not Gothic architecture, but only imitations of its mannerisms. Ruskin's concern was to change industrial society, not to decorate concrete towers with gargoyles. This interest in the stultifying effects of industrialism led Ruskin gradually into economics. After 1860, the The critic of art became, like the writer he most greatly admired, Thomas Carlyle, an outspoken critic of laissez-faire or non-interventionist economics. His conception of the responsibilities of employers toward their workers, as expounded in Unto This Last, 1860, was dismissed by his contemporaries as an absurdity. What he was laboring to show was that self-seeking business relationships could be reconfigured on the principle of dedicated service, taking as a model the learned professions and the military. The soldier, however unrefined, is more highly regarded by society than the capitalist, Ruskin said, for the soldier's trade is not slaying, but being slain. Although his position was essentially conservative in the proper sense of the word, he styled himself a violent Tory of the old school, Walter Scott's school. He was regarded as a radical eccentric. It was many years before his social criticism gained a following among writers as diverse as William Morris, Bernard Shaw, and D.H. Lawrence, and in particular among the founders of the British Labour Party. His influence was to be profound and lasting. Ruskin's realization, after 1860, that despite his fame, he was becoming isolated and that the world was continuing to move in directions opposite from those to which he pointed, may have contributed to the recurrent mental breakdowns from which he suffered between 1870 and 1900. As he reports in Fors Clavigera, 1880, the doctor said I went mad, this time 2 years ago, from overwork, but he had not then been working harder than usual. I went mad because nothing came of my work, because after I got my manuscripts published, nobody believed a word of them. Also contributing to his breakdowns may have been his unhappiness in his relations with women. His marriage to Effie Gray in 1848 was a disaster. After 6 years of living together, an annulment was arranged on the grounds that the marriage had not been consummated. Ruskin testified that he had not found his wife's person physically attractive, although by others she was considered a great beauty. One of these admirers was the Pre-Raphaelite painter John Millais, who fell in love with her at a time when he was painting her husband's portrait. Shortly after the annulment, he married her. Given the spectacular failure of Ruskin's marriage and subsequent romantic relationships, it is ironic that he was to produce a highly influential, and frequently reprinted, description of the ideal characters of man and woman, husband and wife, in an 1864 lecture of Queen's Gardens. In later years, Ruskin fell in love with a young Irish girl, Rose Latouche, whom he first met when he was nearly 40 and she was a child of 9. They were divided not only by the gap of age, but by religious differences. She was an intensely pious believer, and for several years after Ruskin proposed marriage to her, when she was 18, she tried unsuccessfully to persuade him to return to the evangelical faith that he had abandoned. In 1875, after herself suffering attacks of mental illness, Latouche died at the age of 25. In his autobiography, Ruskin commented, I wonder mightily what sort of creature I should have turned out, if instead of the distracting and useless pain, I had had the joy of approved love, and the untellable, incalculable motive of its sympathy and praise. It seems to me such things are not allowed in the world. The men capable of the highest imaginative passion are always tossed on fiery waves by it. Despite both the despair that he suffered following Latouche's death and the recurring attacks of mental illness that blighted the last 35 years of his life, Ruskin remained active and productive up until his final silent decade of the 1890s. His publications during his active period included 6 volumes of his lectures on art that he had delivered as Slade Professor of Fine Arts at Oxford, and his letters to laborers, Fors Clavigera, 1871-84. One topic that becomes especially prominent in these later writings is pollution of air and water, an ideal subject for Ruskin's eloquence. In discussing it, he combines his lifelong love for beautiful landscape and landscape painting with his later acquired conviction that modern industrial leadership was woefully irresponsible. A letter of A. E. Housman, who was an undergraduate at Oxford in 1877, provides a vivid record of how effective Ruskin could be. This afternoon, Ruskin gave us a great outburst against modern times. He had got a picture of Turner's, framed and glassed, representing Leicester and the Abbey in the distance at sunset over a river. He read the account of Wolsey's death out of Henry VIII. Then he pointed to the picture as representing Leicester when Turner had drawn it. Then he said, "You, if you like, may go to Leicester to see what it is like now. I never shall. But I can make a pretty good guess." Then he caught up a paintbrush. "These stepping stones, of course, have been done away with, and are replaced by a beautiful iron bridge." Then he dashed in the iron bridge on the glass of the picture. "The color of the stream is supplied on one side by the indigo factory." Forthwith one side of the stream became indigo. "On the other side by the soap factory." Soap dashed in. "They mix in the middle, like curds," he said, working them together with a sort of malicious deliberation. "This field, over which you see the sun setting behind the Abbey, is now occupied in a proper manner." Then there went a flame of scarlet across the picture, which developed itself into windows and roofs and red brick, and rushed up into a chimney. The atmosphere is supplied thus, a puff and cloud of smoke all over Turner's sky, and then the brush thrown down, and Ruskin confronting modern civilization amidst a tempest of applause, which he always elicits now, as he has this term become immensely popular, his lectures being crowded, whereas of old he used to prophesy to empty benches.